The October wind whistled through the bare branches of the ancient oak trees lining Chestnut Street as the Henderson family's moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of 1847 Willowbrook Lane. Sarah Henderson stepped out of their SUV, pulling her jacket tighter against the Massachusetts chill, and gazed up at the imposing Victorian house that would be their new home. "Well, there she is," David Henderson said, joining his wife on the cracked sidewalk. "Our very own piece of history." The house loomed before them like something from a Gothic novel, its dark shingles weathered by more than a century of New England seasons. Ornate gingerbread trim decorated the wraparound porch, though several pieces hung loose, creaking ominously in the wind. The windows, tall and narrow, seemed to watch them with an almost sentient awareness. "It's bigger than it looked in the photos," Sarah murmured, unconsciously reaching for her 7-year-old son Michael's hand. The boy had been unusually quiet during the drive from their old home in Boston, his face pressed against the car window as they'd wound through Salem's historic streets. "Can we go inside now?" Michael asked, his voice small but eager. Something about the house seemed to draw him in, though he couldn't explain the strange flutter in his chest as he stared at the darkened windows of the third floor. David fumbled with the heavy brass keys the realtor had given them. "The previous owners left some furniture behind," he explained, as the front door creaked open with a sound like settling bones. "Apparently the house has been in the Whitmore family for generations, but the last heir moved to California and couldn't be bothered with the upkeep." The interior greeted them with the musty scent of decades-old dust and something else, something Michael couldn't identify, but that made his skin prickle with goosebumps. The hardwood floors groaned under their feet as they explored room after room of period furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be awakened. "Look at this craftsmanship," David marveled, running his hand along the carved banister of the central staircase. "They don't make houses like this anymore." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows cast long shadows that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Michael wandered ahead, drawn by an inexplicable pull toward the back of the house. In what must have once been a study, he found himself staring at a collection of old photographs hanging on the wall. Most were faded beyond recognition, but one in particular caught his attention. "Mom, Dad, come look at this," he called, his voice echoing in the empty room. The photograph was smaller than the others, framed in tarnished silver. It showed a boy about Michael's age, dressed in the formal clothing of the early 1900s, clutching a wooden toy train against his chest. The boy's eyes held a sadness that seemed to reach across the decades, and Michael felt an odd kinship with the lonely figure in the picture. "That must be from the original family," Sarah said, joining her son. She read the small brass nameplate beneath the frame. "Thomas Whitmore, 1913. "He looks just like me," Michael whispered, and Sarah had to admit there was a striking resemblance. Both boys had the same dark hair, the same serious expression, the same deep brown eyes. "Coincidence," David said dismissively, though he too noticed the similarity. "Come on, let's check out the upstairs before the movers arrive with our stuff." But Michael lingered, unable to tear his gaze away from Thomas's face. The toy train in the photograph seemed almost real, as if he could reach out and touch its smooth wooden surface. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard the distant sound of wheels on tracks, but when he held his breath to listen, there was only silence. As they climbed to the second floor, none of them noticed the way the photograph seemed to shift slightly in its frame, or how Thomas's eyes appeared to follow Michael's retreating form with something that might have been longing. The movers had finished their work by late afternoon, leaving towers of cardboard boxes scattered throughout the house like monuments to their former life. As darkness settled over Salem, the Henderson family found themselves surrounded by the unfamiliar creaks and groans of their new home. "I think that's enough unpacking for one day," Sarah said, surveying the chaos of their temporary living room. "Let's order pizza and call it a night." Michael had spent most of the evening returning to the study, drawn repeatedly to Thomas's photograph. Each time his parents found him there, he claimed he was just exploring, but Sarah noticed how his eyes never left the boy in the picture. "Michael, honey, your room is upstairs," she called, as she found him in the study once again. "Don't you want to see where you'll be sleeping?" The boy's new bedroom was on the second floor, directly above the study. It was spacious, with tall windows overlooking the backyard and built-in bookshelves that previous young occupants had carved their initials into. David had already assembled Michael's bed and placed his favorite stuffed animals on the nightstand. "This room has character," David said, trying to sound enthusiastic despite the way the old house seemed to amplify every sound. "Look, there's even a window seat where you can read." Michael nodded absently, but his attention was drawn to a small door built into the wall near the closet. It was painted white like the rest of the room, but the paint was older, cracked and yellowed with age. "What's behind there?" he asked. "Probably just storage space," David replied, trying the handle. The door was locked and there was no key in sight. "We'll get it open tomorrow. For now, let's focus on getting you settled." That night, as the house settled into darkness, Michael lay in his unfamiliar bed listening to sounds he'd never heard before. The old heating system clanked and hissed, floorboards creaked without anyone walking on them, and somewhere in the walls, mice scurried between the ancient timbers. But it was another sound that eventually pulled him from the edge of sleep, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like wheels rolling across wooden tracks. Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. Michael sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from below, possibly from the study where Thomas's photograph hung. He slipped out of bed and padded to his bedroom door, pressing his ear against the cool wood. The sound was clearer now, definitely the sound of a toy train moving in circles, but that was impossible. There had been no train set in the study, just dusty furniture and old books. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. Unable to resist, Michael crept out of his room and down the stairs, avoiding the spots that creaked loudest. The house was completely dark, except for the streetlight outside that cast long shadows through the windows. The study door was closed, but a thin line of pale light glowed beneath it. Michael's heart hammered as he reached for the doorknob, his small hand trembling. The clicking stopped. Michael froze, his hand inches from the door. The silence was somehow worse than the sound had been, thick and expectant, as if something on the other side was waiting for him. Then, from within the study, came a voice so soft he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Michael. The voice was young, no older than his own, but with an old-fashioned accent he'd only heard in movies about the past. It carried a loneliness that made his chest ache. "Michael, come play with me." His rational mind screamed at him to run back to his parents' room, to wake them and tell them what he was hearing, but something stronger pulled him forward, a connection he couldn't understand or resist. His hand closed around the doorknob and turned. The study was empty, exactly as they'd left it hours earlier. The photograph of Thomas hung in its place on the wall, and moonlight streaming through the windows illuminated nothing more than dust motes dancing in the air. But on the floor, barely visible in the dim light, were thin grooves in the dust, grooves that formed a perfect circle, as if something with wheels had been moving around and around the room, and in the center of that circle, so small he almost missed it, was a single wooden wheel. Michael bent to pick it up, and as his fingers closed around the smooth wood, he could have sworn he heard the distant echo of a child's laughter, bright and joyful, coming from somewhere very far away. When his parents found him the next morning, he was asleep on the study floor, the wooden wheel clutched tightly in his fist. "Michael, wake up, sweetheart." Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away as Michael slowly opened his eyes. Sunlight streamed through the study windows, and he found himself lying on the hardwood floor with his mother's concerned face hovering above him. "What are you doing down here?" she asked, helping him sit up. "You scared us when we couldn't find you in your room." Michael blinked, disoriented. The events of the night felt like a vivid dream, but the wooden wheel was still clutched in his palm, its surface worn smooth by countless hands over the decades. "I heard something," he said quietly, showing his mother the wheel. "A train, and someone was calling my name." David appeared in the doorway, already dressed for his first day at his new job in downtown Salem. "Michael, buddy, you were probably just having a dream. Moving to a new house can be stressful, especially one as old as this." But Sarah noticed the circular grooves in the dust on the floor, the same grooves Michael had seen in the moonlight. She knelt down, running her finger along one of the tracks. "David, look at this. Probably just from when the movers were rearranging furniture," David said dismissively, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Come on, Michael, let's get you some breakfast. You start at Salem Elementary today, remember?" Throughout the morning, Michael kept the wooden wheel in his pocket, rolling it between his fingers during breakfast and clutching it tightly as they drove through Salem's historic streets to his new school. The town looked different in daylight, less ominous but somehow more watchful, as if the centuries-old buildings held secrets they weren't ready to share. Salem Elementary was a brick building that had been educating the town's children since the 1920s. Michael's new teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman in her 50s who had taught 3 generations of Salem families. "Class, we have a new student joining us today," she announced as Michael stood awkwardly at the front of the room. "This is Michael Henderson. His family just moved into the old Whitmore house on Willowbrook Lane." A ripple of whispers went through the classroom. Michael noticed several students exchange meaningful glances, and a girl with red pigtails raised her hand. "My grandma says that house is haunted," she said matter-of-factly. "She says the Whitmore boy never left." "That's enough, Emma," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, but Michael caught the brief look of unease that crossed her face. "Michael, why don't you take the seat next to Jake?" During lunch, Michael found himself surrounded by curious classmates, all eager to hear about the infamous Whitmore house. Jake Morrison, a freckled boy who seemed to know everyone, appointed himself as Michael's unofficial guide to Salem's supernatural folklore. "The whole town knows about Thomas Whitmore," Jake explained as they sat at a corner table in the cafeteria. "He disappeared in 1913. Just vanished one night and they never found him." "What happened to him?" Michael asked, unconsciously reaching for the wheel in his pocket. "Nobody knows for sure," Emma chimed in, having apparently forgiven Mrs. Patterson's earlier rebuke. "Some people say he ran away because his parents were mean to him. Others think he fell down the old well in the backyard and drowned. But my great-aunt lived on your street when she was little," added a boy named Connor. "She always said she could hear him crying at night, especially when it rained. She said he was looking for his toy train." Michael's blood ran cold. "His toy train?" "Yeah, it was his favorite thing in the whole world, hand-carved by his grandfather or something. When Thomas disappeared, the train went missing too. My great-aunt said sometimes you could hear it rolling around the house at night, like Thomas was still playing with it." The wooden wheel seemed to burn in Michael's pocket. He pulled it out, setting it on the cafeteria table. The other children leaned in, their eyes wide. "Where did you get that?" Emma whispered. "I found it this morning," Michael said, "in the study where Thomas's photograph is hanging." Jake picked up the wheel, examining it carefully. "This looks really old, like really, really old." He showed it to the others, pointing to tiny initials carved into the wood. "Look, there are letters here. T.W. Thomas Whitmore." The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Michael could barely concentrate on his lessons, his mind consumed by thoughts of the boy in the photograph and the wheel that now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. That evening, as his family unpacked more boxes, Michael retreated to his room early, claiming he was tired from his first day at school, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. He sat on his bed, rolling the wheel between his palms, waiting for darkness to fall. He didn't have to wait long. As soon as the last light faded from his windows, he heard it again, the soft, rhythmic clicking of wheels on wood coming from the study below. But this time, he was ready. Michael crept downstairs, the wheel clutched tightly in his hand. The study door was open just a crack, and pale light spilled into the hallway. He could hear something moving inside, a gentle scraping sound like wood sliding across the floor. He pushed the door open and gasped. In the center of the room, a wooden toy train moved in slow circles, its brass fittings glinting in the moonlight. It was missing one wheel, rolling lopsidedly but determinedly around its endless track, and sitting cross-legged beside the circular path, translucent and shimmering like morning mist, was Thomas Whitmore. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat as he stared at the impossible scene before him. Thomas Whitmore looked exactly as he did in the photograph, wearing the same dark knickers and white shirt, his hair parted severely to one side in the fashion of 1913. But unlike the photograph, Thomas was moving, breathing, and most unsettling of all, he was looking directly at Michael with eyes full of desperate hope. "You came back," Thomas said, his voice carrying that same old-fashioned accent Michael had heard the night before. "I knew you would. I've been waiting so long for someone to play with me." The toy train continued its lopsided journey around the room, the missing wheel causing it to wobble and scrape against the hardwood floor. Michael watched, mesmerized, as it completed another circuit, leaving those familiar grooves in the dust. "You're Thomas," Michael whispered, finding his voice at last. The ghost boy smiled, and for a moment his face brightened with an innocence that made Michael's chest ache. "You know my name. That makes me so happy. Nobody said my name in such a long time." Michael took a tentative step into the room, the wooden wheel warm in his palm. "This belongs to you, doesn't it?" Thomas's eyes fixed on the wheel with such longing that Michael immediately felt guilty for keeping it. "You found it. I lost it the night He trailed off, his expression growing troubled. "The night everything went dark. What happened to you?" Michael asked, moving closer. Up close he could see that Thomas wasn't entirely solid. The moonlight passed through him like water, and the edges of his form seemed to shimmer and fade. "I don't remember everything," Thomas said, his voice growing smaller. "I remember being angry with Papa. He said I was too old for toys, that I needed to put away childish things. He tried to take my train, the one Grandfather made for me before he died." The toy train wobbled to a stop directly between the two boys. Without its fourth wheel, it leaned heavily to one side, unable to continue its endless journey. "I hid in the walls," Thomas continued, pointing to the small white door in Michael's bedroom above. "There's a space behind there, a secret place where the servants used to store things. I took my train and crawled inside to hide until Papa stopped being angry." Michael knelt down beside the train, noting its intricate craftsmanship. Every detail had been carved with loving care. Tiny windows, a brass smokestack, even miniature couplers that would allow additional cars to be attached. "But you never came out," Michael said softly. Thomas shook his head, and Michael noticed tears glistening on his translucent cheeks. "I fell asleep in the dark place, and when I woke up I couldn't find the door. I called and called, but nobody came. It got so cold and I was so hungry." The implications of Thomas's words hit Michael like a physical blow. The boy hadn't simply disappeared. He had died, trapped in the walls of his own home, clutching his beloved toy train. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered, not knowing what else to say. "Don't be sorry," Thomas said, his voice brightening again. "You're here now. We can be friends. We can play together every night." Michael looked at the wheel in his hand, then at the broken train. Almost without conscious thought, he reached out and fitted the wheel back onto its axle. The moment the pieces connected, the train began to move again, rolling smoothly around its circular path. Thomas clapped his hands in delight, the sound echoing strangely in the quiet room. "You fixed it. Nobody ever fixed anything for me before." But as Michael watched the train complete its circuit, a chill ran down his spine. There was something unsettling about its endless journey, something that spoke of compulsion rather than joy. The train moved with mechanical precision, never varying its path, never stopping, as if it were trapped in its own kind of prison. "Thomas," Michael said carefully, "do you ever leave this room?" The ghost boy's expression faltered. "I can't. This is where my train is. This is where I belong. But you can stay with me. You can live here forever, and we'll never have to grow up or put away our toys or make our papas angry." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Michael noticed frost forming on the windows despite the October warmth outside. Thomas's form was growing more solid, more present, as if their conversation was anchoring him more firmly to the physical world. "I have to go back to my room," Michael said, backing toward the door. "My parents will worry if they find me gone again." "No," Thomas cried, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "Don't leave me alone again. It's so lonely when you're gone. Please, Michael, just stay a little longer." But Michael was already moving, the weight of Thomas's need pressing against him like a physical force. As he reached the doorway, he heard the train derail with a crash, wheels scattering across the floor. "Michael, wait!" He ran up the stairs, his heart pounding, and dove into his bed, pulling the covers over his head. But even through the blankets he could hear Thomas calling his name, the voice growing fainter but no less heartbreaking. "Michael, Michael, please don't leave me alone." It was nearly dawn before the calling finally stopped, and Michael drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of small hands reaching out from dark places, searching for warmth that would never come. The next morning brought no relief from Michael's troubled sleep. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he pushed his cereal around his bowl, barely listening to his parents' conversation about renovation plans and work schedules. "You look tired, sweetheart," Sarah observed, pressing her palm against his forehead to check for fever. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just couldn't sleep," Michael mumbled, not entirely lying. "The house makes a lot of noises at night." David looked up from his newspaper. "Old houses do that. You'll get used to it. In fact, I'm thinking of starting some renovations this weekend. Maybe we can soundproof your room while we're at it." "No!" Michael's response was so sharp that both parents stared at him in surprise. "I mean, my room is fine. Don't change anything." The truth was, Michael had spent most of the early morning hours staring at the small white door in his bedroom wall, the one his father had dismissed as storage space. Now he knew it was much more than that. It was Thomas's final resting place, the dark space where a frightened child had crawled to hide and never emerged. At school, Michael found it impossible to concentrate. During math class, he sketched toy trains in the margins of his worksheets. During reading time, he stared out the window, thinking about Thomas's desperate loneliness. Even lunch with Jake and his new friends couldn't distract him from the weight of the secret he carried. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Emma commented as they walked to afternoon recess. "Get it? Because you live in the haunted house?" "It's not funny," Michael snapped, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Thomas isn't some scary story. He's just a kid who died a long time ago." Jake raised his eyebrows. "Thomas, you mean you actually saw him?" Michael realized too late what he'd revealed. The other children gathered around him, eyes wide with excitement and fear. "What did he look like?" Emma whispered. "Is he scary? Did he try to hurt you? Does he really have his toy train?" Michael backed away from the circle of eager faces. "I have to go," he said, and ran toward the school building, leaving his classmates staring after him. That afternoon, Michael walked home alone through Salem's winding streets, his mind churning with questions. What was he supposed to do with the knowledge that Thomas's spirit was trapped in their house? Who would believe him if he told them? And more troubling still, why did part of him want to return to the study, to comfort the lonely boy who had been calling his name? When he arrived home, he found his mother in the kitchen, surrounded by moving boxes and looking overwhelmed. "Perfect timing," she said, forcing a smile. "Your dad's working late and I could use some help deciding where to put things. Want to explore the attic with me? Maybe we can find some clues about the house's history." The attic was accessed by a narrow staircase behind a door on the second floor that Michael hadn't noticed before. As they climbed into the dusty space under the eaves, their flashlight beams revealed decades of accumulated belongings, trunks full of old clothes, boxes of yellowed photographs, and furniture covered in white sheets. "Look at all this," Sarah breathed. "It's like a museum up here." Michael was drawn to a small trunk in the corner, its brass fittings green with age. Inside, he found toys that must have belonged to generations of children, wooden blocks, tin soldiers, marbles in a glass jar, and at the bottom, wrapped in faded tissue paper, a child's clothing. "These must have been Thomas's," Sarah said softly, lifting out a small white shirt identical to the one in the photograph. "That poor little boy." As she held the shirt up to the light, something fell from its folds and clattered to the floor. Michael's flashlight beam revealed a small brass key, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. "What do you think this opens?" Sarah wondered aloud. But Michael already knew. His heart began to pound as he pocketed the key, recognizing it instinctively as the answer to the locked door in his bedroom wall. That evening, after his parents had gone to bed, Michael lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around him. But tonight, there was no clicking of wheels from the study below, no distant voice calling his name. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Michael slipped out of bed and approached the small white door. The brass key fit perfectly into the hidden lock, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the walls. The door swung open, revealing a narrow space between the walls just large enough for a small child to crawl inside. Michael's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, illuminating a cramped passage that ran behind the walls of the house. And there, in a small alcove barely 3 feet wide, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A child's skeleton lay curled in the corner, still wearing the remnants of knickers and a white shirt. Clutched in the tiny hands was a wooden toy train, missing one wheel. And scattered around the small space were the desperate scratches of fingernails on wood, evidence of a frightened child's attempts to claw his way back to freedom. But most horrifying of all was the realization that dawned on Michael as he stared at the tragic scene. Thomas Whitmore hadn't simply died in this hidden space over a century ago. He was still here, still trapped, still waiting for someone to find him and set him free. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging Michael into absolute darkness. And in that darkness he heard a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Now you know where I am. Will you help me, Michael? Will you stay with me so I won't be alone anymore?" The temperature plummeted, and Michael's breath came out in visible puffs as something small and cold touched his hand. Michael yanked his hand back from the cold touch, his heart hammering against his ribs as he scrambled backward from the hidden alcove. The flashlight flickered back to life in his trembling grip, casting wild shadows on the walls as he fought to catch his breath. "Thomas," he whispered into the darkness. The temperature in the small space began to rise slightly, and Michael saw a faint shimmer in the air near the skeletal remains. Gradually, Thomas's ghostly form materialized, kneeling beside his own bones with an expression of profound sadness. "You found me," Thomas said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I've been waiting so long for someone to find me." Michael forced himself to look at the tragic scene before him. The small skeleton seemed impossibly fragile, and he could see where Thomas had tried desperately to scratch his way through the wooden walls, his young fingernails leaving permanent marks in the old timber. "How long were you trapped here before—" Michael couldn't finish the question. 3 days, Thomas replied quietly. 3 days calling for Papa and Mama, but they thought I had run away. They were searching the woods and the riverbank while I was right here, so close they could have heard me if they'd listened." The ghost boy reached out toward his remains with translucent fingers that passed harmlessly through the bones. "I was so thirsty, and it got so cold. I held my train tight and pretended I was taking a long journey somewhere warm and bright." Michael felt tears stinging his eyes. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry no one found you." "But you found me now," Thomas said, his face brightening with hope. "That means we can be together always. You can come into the walls with me, and we'll never be separated. We'll never grow up or have to face angry parents or put away our toys." A chill ran down Michael's spine that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold. There was something unsettling about the way Thomas spoke of never growing up, never changing, never leaving. "I can't stay here, Thomas," Michael said gently. "I have to go back to my room. My parents would be scared if they couldn't find me." Thomas's expression darkened, and the temperature dropped again. "Your parents don't understand you like I do. They'll try to take away your toys, just like Papa tried to take mine. They'll tell you to grow up and stop believing in magic." "That's not true," Michael protested. But even as he said it, he remembered his father's dismissive attitude toward the supernatural sounds in the house. "Come with me, Michael," Thomas pleaded, extending his ghostly hand. "Touch my hand and you'll see. You'll understand why we need to stay together." Despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat, Michael found himself drawn forward. There was something hypnotic about Thomas's desperate need, something that called to the lonely parts of his own heart. What would it be like to have a friend who truly understood him, who would never judge him or leave him behind? Michael reached out, his fingers inches from Thomas's translucent palm. The moment their hands would have met, a searing cold shot up Michael's arm like lightning. Images flooded his mind, flashes of Thomas's life, his lonely days in the big house with parents who were always busy, always distant. The crushing weight of adult expectations, the suffocating pressure to be perfect, to grow up before he was ready. But mixed with Thomas's memories were darker things, the desperation of those final 3 days, the terror of being trapped and forgotten, and beneath it all a growing hunger for companionship that had twisted over the decades into something possessive and needy. Michael jerked his hand back, gasping. "No, Thomas, I can't." The ghost boy's face contorted with hurt and anger. "You're just like everyone else. You'll leave me too. You'll forget about me and grow up and have new friends, and I'll be alone forever." The walls around them began to groan and creak, as if the house itself was responding to Thomas's emotional outburst. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Michael heard his parents' voices from the bedroom. "Michael, are you all right in there?" "The flashlight," Michael called back, thinking quickly. "It went out and I was trying to find my way to the bathroom." "Do you need help?" His mother's voice, concerned and getting closer. "I'm fine," Michael said, backing out of the hidden space, "just going back to bed." But as he closed the small door and turned the key, he could hear Thomas calling after him, his voice growing more desperate with each word. "Don't leave me alone, Michael. Please don't leave me alone in the dark again." Michael climbed back into his bed, but sleep was impossible. Through the walls he could hear Thomas crying, a sound so heartbroken it made his chest ache. Part of him wanted to go back, to comfort the lonely spirit, but the memory of that searing cold and the possessive hunger he'd sensed in Thomas's touch kept him frozen under his covers. The crying continued until dawn, and when it finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse. Michael lay in the growing light, staring at the innocent-looking white door, wondering what he had unleashed by making contact with the desperate spirit trapped behind it. At breakfast, his parents noticed his exhaustion, but attributed it to the stress of adjusting to a new home. They had no idea that upstairs, in the walls of their house, something that had been dormant for over a century was now fully awake and focused entirely on their son. And in the study below, the toy train sat motionless on its shelf, waiting for the darkness to fall again, so it could resume its endless journey around and around and around. The days following Michael's discovery of Thomas's remains blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and mounting dread. Each night brought more vivid encounters with the lonely spirit, and each morning found Michael more withdrawn and pale. His parents noticed the change, but attributed it to the stress of settling into their new home and school. "Maybe we should have him see someone," Sarah suggested to David as they watched Michael pick at his dinner, his attention focused on some invisible point beyond the dining room window. "A counselor who specializes in helping children adjust to major life changes." "He's just tired," David replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Give him another week or two. If he doesn't improve, we'll look into it." But Michael wasn't simply tired. He was being slowly consumed by Thomas's need for companionship, a hunger that grew stronger with each passing night. The ghost boy no longer waited for Michael to visit the study. Instead, he appeared in Michael's bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor or perched on the window seat, always watching, always waiting. "You look sad today," Thomas observed on Thursday evening, as Michael tried unsuccessfully to focus on his homework. "Did someone at school hurt your feelings?" Michael glanced up from his math worksheet, unsurprised to find Thomas's translucent form materializing near his bed. The ghost boy's appearances had become so routine that Michael barely reacted anymore. "Jake and Connor didn't want to play with me at recess," Michael admitted. "They said I was acting weird, talking to myself." Thomas's expression brightened with satisfaction. "I told you they wouldn't understand. Living children never do. They're too concerned with growing up and fitting in to appreciate real friendship." "But they used to be my friends," Michael protested weakly. "Were they really?" Thomas moved closer, his presence bringing the familiar supernatural chill to the room. "Did they ever really listen to you? Did they care about the things you cared about? Or did they just pretend to like you because you were new and interesting?" Michael wanted to argue, but Thomas's words struck uncomfortably close to home. His new classmates had been fascinated by his connection to the haunted house, but when he'd stopped sharing supernatural stories, their interest had quickly waned. "I'm the only one who truly understands you," Thomas continued, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality that made Michael's thoughts feel fuzzy and distant. "I'm the only one who will never leave you or judge you or tell you to stop believing in magic." That night, Michael dreamed he was playing with Thomas in a sunlit meadow that existed somewhere outside of time. They ran toy trains through elaborate tracks made of golden light, their laughter echoing across an endless landscape where it was always summer and no one ever had to grow up or face disappointment. He woke to find frost covering his bedroom windows, despite the November warmth outside, and realized with growing alarm that the dream had felt more real than his waking life. At school the next day, Michael's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, kept him after class to express her concerns about his declining performance and increasing isolation from his classmates. "Michael, I'm worried about you," she said gently, sitting on the edge of her desk so she could look him in the eye. "You seem distracted lately, and the other children say you've been talking to yourself during recess." "I'm not talking to myself," Michael said quietly. "I'm talking to Thomas." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew troubled. She had taught in Salem long enough to know the stories about the Whitmore house, and she'd seen the photograph of Thomas Whitmore that hung in the Historical Society's collection of local artifacts. "Michael, I know moving to a new place can be difficult, and sometimes our imaginations can help us cope with loneliness, but it's important to distinguish between fantasy and reality." "Thomas isn't fantasy," Michael insisted, with more passion than he'd shown in days. "He's real. He's my friend." Mrs. Patterson made a note to call Michael's parents that evening, but by then it was already too late to stop what Thomas had set in motion. That night, as Michael lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house, he heard something new. Footsteps in the hallway outside his room, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the soft scraping of something being dragged across the floor. Michael crept to his door and peered out into the darkened hallway. Thomas stood at the top of the stairs, no longer translucent but solid and real-looking in the moonlight. In his hands, he carried his wooden toy train, and behind him stretched a track made of what looked like shadows and starlight. "Come play with me, Michael," Thomas called softly. "I've built us a railroad that goes everywhere and nowhere. We can ride it together forever." The track extended down the staircase and disappeared into the depths of the house, pulsing with an otherworldly light that hurt Michael's eyes to look at directly. He could hear the distant sound of a train whistle, lonely and haunting, calling him to board a journey that would never end. "I've been so patient," Thomas continued, his voice carrying a note of desperation beneath its hypnotic calm. "I've waited over 100 years for a friend like you. Please don't make me wait any longer." Michael felt his feet moving forward without his conscious command, drawn by the supernatural pull of Thomas's need. The ghost boy smiled as Michael approached, extending one pale hand in invitation. "That's right," Thomas whispered. "Just take my hand and we'll never be separated again. We'll ride the shadow train to a place where time stops and friendship lasts forever." Michael reached out, his fingers inches from Thomas's palm, when a sound from downstairs broke the spell, the crash of breaking glass and his father's voice shouting in alarm. "Sarah, something's wrong with the house." The sound of his father's alarmed voice shattered the supernatural trance that had been pulling Michael toward Thomas's outstretched hand. The shadow railroad vanished like smoke, and Thomas's solid form wavered back into translucency, his face contorting with frustrated rage. "No!" Thomas cried, his voice echoing through the house with such force that the windows rattled in their frames. "You can't leave me now, we were so close." Michael stumbled backward, his mind clearing as if waking from a powerful dream. Downstairs, he could hear his parents' voices rising in panic as more glass shattered, and the house groaned around them like a living thing in pain. "Michael!" Sarah's voice called from below. "Michael, where are you?" "I have to go," Michael said, backing toward the stairs. "My parents need me." Thomas's form flickered between solid and transparent, his emotions making the very air in the hallway shimmer with supernatural energy. "They don't need you like I do. They'll grow old and die and leave you alone, but I'll be with you forever." The house shuddered, and Michael heard the sound of every door in the building slamming shut simultaneously. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the pale glow emanating from Thomas's increasingly agitated spirit. Michael ran down the stairs, guided by his parents' voices and the beam of a flashlight cutting through the supernatural gloom. He found them in the living room, huddled together as furniture moved of its own accord, and picture frames flew off the walls to shatter on the hardwood floor. "Michael, thank God," Sarah said, pulling him into her arms. "Something's happening to the house. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes, and everything started moving on its own." David was on his phone trying to reach emergency services, but the device emitted only static. "The phone lines are dead. The power's out on the whole street, but this feels different. This feels supernatural," Sarah finished, her voice barely a whisper. Above them, Thomas's cries of anguish echoed through the house, no longer confined to Michael's hearing alone. The ghost boy's century of loneliness and frustration had reached a breaking point, and his emotional outburst was affecting the very fabric of reality around them. "Michael!" Thomas's voice boomed from every room at once. "Come back to me. Don't let them take you away." The family pressed together as the house seemed to pulse around them like a heartbeat. Wallpaper peeled away from the walls in long strips, revealing the ancient wooden beams beneath. The floorboards buckled and warped, and through the gaps they could see a soft, otherworldly light emanating from the basement. "We need to get out of here," David said, grabbing his car keys. But when they reached the front door, it refused to budge, as if the house itself was determined to keep them inside. "The windows," Sarah suggested, but they found every exit sealed by an invisible force that felt solid as steel. "He won't let us leave," Michael said quietly, finally understanding the true extent of Thomas's power. "He's been alone for so long that he's forgotten how to let anyone go." His parents stared at him in the flickering light of David's flashlight. "Who won't let us leave?" Sarah asked, though the growing horror in her eyes suggested she already knew. "Thomas Whitmore, the boy who died in our house in 1913. He's been trapped here ever since, and he wants me to stay with him forever." The house groaned around them, and they heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. Thomas appeared at the bottom of the staircase, more solid than Michael had ever seen him, his eyes burning with desperate determination. "I tried to be patient," Thomas said, his child's voice carrying an otherworldly authority that made the walls themselves seem to listen. "I tried to wait for Michael to choose me willingly, but you're poisoning him against me with your talk of schools and friends and growing up." Sarah instinctively moved to shield Michael, but Thomas raised his hand, and she found herself frozen in place, unable to move or speak. "I won't hurt them," Thomas said to Michael, his tone becoming gentle and coaxing once more. "I'll just keep them here, safe and still, while you and I play together. They won't grow old or die or leave you if time stops for them too." Michael looked at his parents' terrified faces and felt a surge of protective anger that momentarily overwhelmed his fear. "Let them go, Thomas. This is between you and me." "You're right," Thomas smiled, and it was a child's innocent smile made terrible by the centuries of loneliness behind it. "This is between us. It always has been. From the moment you walked into my house, I knew you were meant to be my friend forever." The supernatural light from the basement grew brighter, and Michael realized with growing dread that Thomas wasn't just asking him to be a friend. The ghost boy wanted him to join him in death, to become another spirit trapped in the house for eternity. "I won't do it," Michael said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I won't leave my family." Thomas's expression darkened, and the house responded to his mood, the walls beginning to bleed a dark substance that smelled of earth and decay. "Then I'll bring them with us. We'll all be together forever, one big, happy family that never has to face separation or loss." The temperature plummeted until their breath came out in visible puffs, and Michael realized that Thomas wasn't just threatening to keep them prisoner. The ghost boy's power had grown so strong that he was beginning to blur the line between life and death itself. The dark substance seeping from the walls began to pool on the floor, and Michael watched in horror as it moved with purpose, creeping toward his frozen parents like living shadow. Where it touched their feet, frost immediately formed, and he could see their skin taking on a pale, lifeless quality. "Stop it!" Michael shouted, lunging forward to brush the substance away from his mother's shoes. The moment his hands touched the dark liquid, images flooded his mind. Thomas's final moments trapped and dying in the walls, his life force slowly draining away until only his desperate need for companionship remained. Thomas watched with satisfaction as Michael recoiled from the vision. "You see, that's what it feels like to be alone, to be forgotten. But I can save your family from that fate. I can preserve them here forever, where they'll never have to experience loss or pain or abandonment." "That's not living," Michael said, his voice breaking. "That's not what they would want." "How do you know what they want?" Thomas's form flickered with agitation. "Adults never know what they really want. They think they want to grow old and watch their children leave them, but they don't. Deep down, they want what I'm offering: eternal togetherness." The supernatural light from the basement pulsed brighter, and Michael could hear something moving down there, something large and mechanical. The sound was familiar, the rhythmic clicking of wheels on tracks, but magnified 100-fold. "What's in the basement?" Michael asked, though he dreaded the answer. Thomas's smile was both innocent and terrifying. "My real train, the one I've been building for over a century, adding car after car for all the friends I hope to make. It's almost finished now. There's room for your whole family." The house shuddered as something massive moved beneath them, and through the gaps in the warped floorboards, Michael caught glimpses of an otherworldly locomotive crafted from shadow and bone, its cars stretching back into an impossible darkness that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the basement. "Come see," Thomas urged, gesturing toward the basement door. "Come see what I've prepared for us." Michael's parents remained frozen, their eyes tracking his movements, but their bodies held in supernatural stasis. The dark substance had crept higher, now covering their ankles, and he could see the life slowly draining from their faces. "If I go with you," Michael said carefully, "will you let them go?" "Oh, Michael," Thomas said with genuine sadness, "you still don't understand. There is no letting go. There's only staying together forever or being alone forever. I chose together." The basement door swung open on its own, revealing stairs that descended into a light that hurt to look at directly. The sound of the phantom train grew louder, its whistle calling across dimensions with a loneliness that made Michael's bones ache. "The train is leaving soon," Thomas said, beginning to descend the stairs, "and it only stops here once every 100 years. If we miss it, I'll have to wait another century for another chance to find a friend." Michael looked at his parents one last time, memorizing their faces in case he never saw them alive again. Then he followed Thomas down into the basement, each step taking him further from the world of the living, and closer to whatever lay waiting in the supernatural depths below. The basement had been transformed into something that defied the laws of physics. The space stretched far beyond what should have been possible, extending into caverns of shadow and starlight. And there, on tracks that seemed to be made of crystallized time itself, sat the most beautiful and terrible train Michael had ever seen. It was enormous, its black locomotive breathing steam that sparkled with captured souls. Each car was different. Some looked like vintage passenger coaches, others resembled ornate funeral carriages, and still others were simply boxcars filled with a soft, inviting light that promised eternal rest. "Isn't it magnificent?" Thomas said, his voice filled with pride. "I've been working on it ever since I died, adding improvements, making it perfect. Each car is designed for a different kind of passenger. This one is for children who were lonely like me. This one is for parents who never wanted their children to grow up. And this one," He gestured to a car that looked exactly like a child's bedroom, complete with toys and picture books and a warm golden light that made Michael think of bedtime stories and lullabies. "This one is for us," Thomas finished. "We'll ride together through the spaces between life and death, playing forever in a world where time has no meaning and love never fades." The train's whistle sounded again, and Michael felt a pull so strong it was almost physical. Part of him wanted to board, to escape the pain and uncertainty of growing up, to find the perfect friendship that Thomas promised. But then he remembered his parents upstairs, slowly being drained of life by Thomas's supernatural influence. He thought of Jake and Emma and his other classmates, imperfect friends perhaps, but real ones, who existed in the world of sunlight and possibility. "No," Michael said, his voice barely audible over the train's mechanical symphony. "I won't go with you, Thomas, and I won't let you take my family either." Thomas's face crumpled with hurt and rage. "You're just like everyone else. You'll leave me alone in the dark forever." "I don't want to leave you alone," Michael said, moving closer to the distraught spirit. "But this isn't the answer. Trapping people here won't make you less lonely. It will just make everyone else as trapped and sad as you are." The train began to move, its wheels grinding against the crystalline tracks with a sound like breaking glass. Thomas looked between Michael and the departing locomotive with panic in his eyes. "It's leaving!" he cried. "My train is leaving, and if you don't come with me now, I'll be alone for another 100 years. The whistle faded into the distance, and the magnificent train vanished into the spaces between worlds, leaving only empty tracks and the echo of what might have been. Thomas collapsed to his knees, his form flickering like a candle in the wind, and for the first time since Michael had met him, he looked exactly like what he was, a frightened, lonely child who had been dead for over a century. In the fading light of the departed train, the basement returned to its normal dimensions, becoming once again just a dusty storage space beneath an old house. Thomas knelt on the concrete floor, his ghostly form more fragile than Michael had ever seen it, flickering between visibility and nothingness like a dying star. 100 years, Thomas whispered, his voice broken with despair. 100 more years of silence and darkness, and watching through the walls as families move in and out, never staying, never seeing me. Michael felt his heart breaking for the lonely spirit. Despite everything Thomas had done, despite the terror he'd inflicted on Michael's family, he was still just a frightened child who had died alone and scared over a century ago. "It doesn't have to be that way," Michael said gently, sitting down beside Thomas on the cold floor. "There are other choices." Thomas looked up with eyes that held more pain than any child should ever know. "What other choices?" "I'm dead, Michael. I've been dead for so long I barely remember what it felt like to be alive. The only thing that kept me here was the hope that someday someone would stay with me. But staying here isn't really being together," Michael said, choosing his words carefully. "It's just being trapped in the same place. Real friendship, real love isn't about never leaving. It's about caring for someone, even when you can't be with them." Upstairs the house groaned and settled, and Michael could hear the dark substance retreating from his parents, their life force slowly returning as Thomas's grip on the physical world weakened. "I don't know how to let go," Thomas admitted, his form becoming more transparent with each word. "I've held on for so long I don't remember how to do anything else." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden wheel he'd been carrying since that first night. He held it out to Thomas, and the ghost boy's eyes widened with recognition and longing. "This belongs to you," Michael said, "and so does your train upstairs. Maybe it's time to put them back together, but not to trap people. To remember what it felt like to play because you wanted to, not because you were afraid of being alone." Thomas stared at the wheel, his ghostly fingers hovering just above its surface. "If I take it back, if I complete my train, I might disappear. The only thing keeping me here is the incompleteness, the need to find what was lost. Maybe disappearing isn't the worst thing," Michael said softly. "Maybe it's just another kind of journey." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the settling of the old house above them. Then Thomas spoke, his voice smaller than ever. "Will you stay with me until it happens? Will you be here so I don't have to face it alone?" Michael nodded, tears running down his cheeks. "I'll stay." Thomas reached out with trembling hands and gently took the wooden wheel. The moment his fingers closed around it, his form began to solidify, becoming more real and present than he'd been since his death. But it wasn't the threatening solidity of his earlier manifestations. This was different, peaceful, like a photograph finally coming into focus. "Come with me," Thomas said, rising to his feet. Let's go finish what I started so long ago. They climbed the basement stairs together, and Michael was relieved to find his parents awake and moving, the supernatural paralysis broken. Sarah immediately pulled him into her arms, while David examined the damage to their home with shaking hands. "Michael, what happened?" Sarah asked. "One moment we couldn't move, and then suddenly everything returned to normal." "I'll explain later," Michael promised. "But first, I need to help Thomas with something." His parents followed as Michael led Thomas to the study, where the antique toy train sat on its shelf. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, the wooden locomotive looked exactly as it had in the old photograph, except for the missing wheel that would complete it. Thomas approached his childhood treasure with reverence, his ghostly hands shaking as he knelt beside it. "I remember when Grandfather carved this for me. He said it would take me on adventures to places I'd never imagined. Maybe it still will," Michael said quietly. Thomas carefully fitted the wheel onto its axle, and the moment the train was complete, it began to glow with a soft, warm light. Not the harsh, supernatural radiance of the phantom locomotive, but something gentle and welcoming, like sunshine on a summer morning. The light grew brighter, enveloping Thomas in its warmth, and his form began to change. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by something Michael had never seen there before. "Peace. I can see it," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "The place Grandfather promised. There are other children there, children like me who got lost along the way. And there are grown-ups too, the kind who remember what it was like to believe in magic." Thomas turned to Michael one last time, and his smile was radiant with joy and gratitude. "Thank you for helping me remember that letting go isn't the same as being forgotten. Thank you for being my friend when I needed one most." The light surrounded Thomas completely now, and through its glow, Michael could see the faint outline of a real train, not made of shadow and bone, but of golden light and childhood dreams. Thomas climbed aboard, waving goodbye as the spectral locomotive began to move. "Will I see you again?" Michael called out. Thomas's laughter floated back to him, bright and free for the first time in over a century. "Maybe someday when you're ready for your own great adventure, but not for a very long time, I hope." The train faded into the distance, taking Thomas with it, and the study returned to normal. The antique toy train sat motionless on its shelf, just a wooden toy once again, but somehow it seemed less lonely now, as if it had finally fulfilled its purpose. The first thing Michael noticed when he woke up was the silence. Not the oppressive, watchful quiet that had filled the house since they'd moved in, but a peaceful stillness that felt natural and welcoming. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom windows, warming the air and casting dancing patterns on the walls, where frost had formed night after night. He looked toward the small white door in the wall and found it standing open. The space beyond was empty now, just a storage alcove that smelled of old wood and memories. Thomas's remains were gone, though Michael somehow knew they hadn't simply vanished. They had found their proper rest at last. Downstairs, his parents were surveying the damage from the previous night. Picture frames lay shattered on the floor, wallpaper hung in strips, and several windows bore spiderweb cracks from the supernatural forces that had torn through the house. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling Michael into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Michael said, and realized he meant it. The constant exhaustion that had plagued him for weeks was gone, replaced by a lightness he hadn't felt since before they'd moved to Salem. David set down his coffee mug and looked at his son seriously. "Michael, we need to talk about what happened last night. About Thomas." Michael had expected this conversation, and he'd spent the early morning hours thinking about how to explain something that most adults would dismiss as impossible. But his parents had seen the supernatural forces at work. They'd felt Thomas's presence as tangibly as he had. "Thomas Whitmore was a real boy who lived here in 1913, Michael began. "He died in the walls of this house, and his spirit has been trapped here ever since, waiting for someone to help him find peace." Sarah and David exchanged glances, the kind of look parents share when their child says something that challenges everything. They thought they knew about the world. "You're saying you've been talking to a ghost," David said slowly. "I'm saying I've been talking to a lonely child who needed a friend," Michael corrected. Being dead didn't change who Thomas was inside. He was still scared and sad, and wanting someone to care about him. Sarah sat down beside Michael on the couch, carefully avoiding the broken glass scattered across the floor. Is he still here?" Michael shook his head. "He's gone. He found what he was looking for and moved on to wherever children go when they're ready to stop being afraid." They spent the morning cleaning up the damage and talking about their experience. Michael told them about his conversations with Thomas, about the discovery of the remains in the wall, and about the choice he'd made to help the ghost boy find peace rather than eternal companionship. "I'm proud of you," David said, as they swept up the last of the broken glass. "What you did took incredible courage. You chose to help someone even when it would have been easier to just give them what they wanted." "Thomas wasn't bad," Michael said, wanting his parents to understand. "He was just so lonely that he forgot the difference between love and possession. He thought keeping people forever was the same as being loved forever." That afternoon, Michael walked to Salem Elementary with a lightness in his step that had been missing for weeks. He felt like himself again, no longer torn between two worlds or weighed down by supernatural responsibility. At lunch, Jake and Emma approached him cautiously, clearly uncertain about his recent strange behavior. "Hey, Michael," Jake said. "Are you feeling better? You seemed really out of it for a while there." "I'm much better," Michael said, and meant it. "I was dealing with some stuff at home, but it's resolved now." "Good," Emma said, relief evident in her voice. "We missed hanging out with you. Want to play soccer at recess?" Michael smiled, feeling the simple pleasure of normal childhood friendship. "I'd like that." As they ran onto the playground together, Michael caught sight of the old Whitmore house in the distance, its Victorian silhouette no longer seeming ominous against the autumn sky. It was just a house now, full of history and memories, but no longer haunted by unfinished business. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner in their slowly healing home, Sarah made an announcement that surprised no one. "I called a contractor today. We are going to renovate the house properly, but we're also going to research its history and maybe create a small memorial for Thomas. He deserves to be remembered as more than just a ghost story." Michael nodded approvingly. "I think Thomas would like that. He just wanted someone to know that he existed, that his life mattered." That night, for the first time since they'd moved to Salem, Michael slept peacefully through the night. No supernatural cold woke him, no distant voices called his name, and no toy trains rolled through his dreams. The house settled around them with the comfortable creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to new inhabitants, but there was nothing threatening in the sounds. They were simply the house's way of welcoming its new family, of acknowledging that some chapters end so that new ones can begin. In the study below, Thomas's toy train sat quietly on its shelf, complete and at peace, a symbol of childhood dreams fulfilled and friendship that transcends even death. 1 year later, the Henderson house on Willowbrook Lane had been transformed. The Victorian mansion stood proud and welcoming, its restored gingerbread trim gleaming with fresh paint and its windows sparkling in the afternoon sun. The Henderson family had not only made it their home, but had turned it into something Thomas Whitmore would have recognized and loved, a place where children's laughter echoed through the halls and where the past was honored rather than forgotten. Michael, now 8 and having grown 2 inches taller, led a small group of visitors through the house on a crisp October afternoon. The Salem Historical Society had partnered with his family to create guided tours that told the true story of the Whitmore family and honored Thomas's memory. "This is the study where Thomas spent much of his time," Michael explained to the fascinated group of tourists, gesturing to the room that had once been the center of supernatural activity. "His toy train is displayed here, along with photographs and artifacts from his life." The wooden train sat in a place of honor behind glass, accompanied by a small plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas Whitmore, 1906-1913, a boy who loved trains and dreamed of great adventures. His journey continues." Mrs. Patterson, Michael's teacher, had brought her class on the tour as part of their local history unit. Jake and Emma walked beside Michael, proud of their friend, who had become something of a local celebrity for his role in solving Salem's most enduring mystery. "Did Thomas really move on to a better place?" Emma asked quietly as they stood before the memorial display. "I believe he did," Michael said with confidence. "Sometimes people get stuck between where they are and where they need to be. Thomas just needed someone to help him find his way." After the tour ended, Michael's family gathered in the renovated kitchen for their traditional Sunday dinner. The house felt completely different now, filled with warmth and life and the comfortable chaos of a family that had put down deep roots. "The Salem Gazette wants to do a follow-up article about the house," Sarah mentioned, as she passed around homemade apple pie. "They're calling it From Haunted to Healing, How One Family Transformed a Tragic History into Hope." Michael smiled, thinking about how proud Thomas would be to know that his story was bringing people together rather than driving them away. The tours had raised funds for a new playground at Salem Elementary, built in Thomas's honor. That evening, as Michael prepared for bed in his room that no longer held any supernatural chill, he noticed something that made him pause. On his nightstand, beside his current favorite book about trains and the places they could take you, sat a small wooden toy he'd never seen before. It was a tiny passenger car, perfectly carved and painted, clearly meant to attach to Thomas's train downstairs. But this car was different from the antique locomotive. It was new, crafted in a modern style, but with the same loving attention to detail. Michael picked up the car and found a note tucked underneath it, written in his mother's handwriting, from the Salem Woodworking Guild. They wanted to add to Thomas's train to show that his story continues to inspire new adventures. As Michael examined the beautifully crafted car, he could have sworn he heard something in the distance, not the supernatural clicking that had once filled the house with dread, but the cheerful whistle of a train embarking on a grand adventure, carrying happy passengers toward bright destinations. He smiled and placed the car carefully on his shelf, knowing that in the morning he would take it downstairs and add it to Thomas's display. The train that had once symbolized desperate loneliness and the desire to trap others now represented hope, continuity, and the idea that every ending could become a new beginning. Outside his window, Salem settled into peaceful sleep, its historic streets holding centuries of stories, but no longer haunted by unfinished business. The Whitmore house stood as a testament to the power of compassion over fear, understanding over superstition, and love over loneliness. Michael fell asleep to the sound of his parents talking quietly downstairs, planning improvements to the memorial garden they were creating in the backyard. In his dreams, he sometimes saw Thomas, but not as the desperate, clinging spirit he had once been. Instead, Thomas appeared as he should have been, a happy child playing with friends in endless summer sunshine, his toy train carrying them all on adventures that would never end, but would always lead them home. The photograph of Thomas still hung in the study, but his expression seemed different now. The sadness was gone from his eyes, replaced by peace and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you are remembered, loved and free. And in Salem, Massachusetts, on Willowbrook Lane, the Henderson family continued to build their life in a house that was no longer haunted by the past but blessed by the memory of a lonely boy who had finally found his way home.